Alright, you guys, this episode of Paradigm Profiles is about Salvador Lil Man Castaneda. This profile is about the true story, the circumstances, and the details surrounding the murder of Salvador Lil Man Castaneda. I'm sure a lot of you have heard different accounts of this story before, and I'm sure there's been a lot of people who claim that they knew the true accurate story, but this simply isn't true. I've personally heard and read some of the details that were put out there by the media, by several journalists who were writing books on the NF, and even by some law enforcement officers who weren't actually involved in the investigation, but yet claimed that they knew the real story. Not even The Rise and Fall of the Nuestra Familia by Robert Huerito Grattan gave up the details of the story. So for those of you who don't know the NF history and the details of what happened, you're gonna get the real story right here. Some of the misconceptions and misrepresentations that have been put out there are laughable, and even some of the facts have been fabricated or embellished just for the purpose of telling a good story. It just muddies the waters and causes confusion. One of the biggest fallacies that's been embellished about this story is that the killers purposely formed a 14 with the fingers of Lil Man's hands in an effort to mislead law enforcement. The story is that by doing this, the two perpetrators believed that law enforcement would be thrown off and diverted into believing that the hit was carried out by Norteños and not the Nuestra Familia. This is simply not true. Now, before I get into the crux of the factual story, let me just give you some of the background history as to how and why Lil Man got himself in trouble. Some of the things that got Lil Man in hot water go all the way back to the early part of 1995 when he ended up in the Monterey County Jail with Mike MC Castillo, Rico Smiley Garcia, Vincent Chente Garcia, and Isidro Chilo Huerta. At the time, there really wasn't a whole lot going on in the county jail. Some of the brothers were in on short parole violations, and some of them were fighting new cases. But other than that, not much was going on. MC was the overall authority in the jail, and like always, he had established a strong functioning household in the jail. At one point, while they were there, Lil Man's younger brother, Pablo Castaneda, had returned to the jail to go to court on a case for child custody. Of course, since he was from Salinas and did his own reconnaissance of the jail while he was in booking, he knew his older brother Lil Man was there and looked forward to being housed in the same pod with him. But Pablo wasn't exactly in the best of standings with the homeboys, and this was something that was widely known. In fact, this is something that him and Lil Man had even spoken about in the past, and they had even devised contingency plans about what they would do and how they would react if they were ever in the county jail and Pablo encountered issues with the homeboys. Lil Man had always said that he would never let his little brother be harmed in front of him, and he said he'd fight beside him if it ever came down to it, but he also hoped that Pablo wouldn't put him in that situation either. Pablo had been accused of committing numerous acts of treason that stemmed from him allegedly acting as a double agent in prison by setting up Norteños to be hit by Sureños. This was a serious allegation, and a lot of homeboys from Salinas wanted to kill him for this. Smiley and some of the other C's that were there just so happened to be some of the main ones who were pushing for Pablo's demise. When Pablo walked into the pod where everybody was at, Lil Man just looked at his little brother and felt a huge pang of disappointment. It wasn't that he wasn't happy to see his younger brother, it was because he knew this was going to be an issue, and he had always told Pablo to never put him in a precarious position like this. As for Smiley and the others, upon seeing Pablo, they immediately began to go for their weapons and began readying themselves for what was about to come, as they had assumed they were all on the same page. At the time, Smiley was MC's second in command, and he immediately began expressing his opinion about what they should do and how Pablo was a known degenerate. He was adamant about the fact that Pablo's presence shouldn't be welcomed, and he emphatically expressed this to MC. As a result, a junta, or a meeting, was called to discuss a plan of action and a whole court as to Pablo's consequences. It was overwhelmingly decided, with the exception of Lil Man, that Pablo had caused far too much damage and that he should be hit and or removed from the affiliated section. The task was then given to Chilo with specific instructions to make it a one-hitter quitter. They wanted to kill him, but with a plastic pedazo, Chilo was told to just hit him in the neck one good time as soon as he got the drop on him. Following the junta and after formulating the plan of action, Chilo went in his cell and quickly fashioned a plastic one-hitter quitter. But as Chilo was putting the finishing touches on the weapon, Lil Man was in his cell, weighing this all out in his mind. On one hand, he was an honorable C who had never been in hot water, and he wanted to do the right thing. But on the other hand, Pablo was his little brother, and he just couldn't stand there and watch someone else try to take him out. This was the first time his loyalty to the familia really had been tested, and even though he had real aspirations to do the right thing, and he felt like his heart was in the right place, he ultimately failed the test. Before the hit was set to go down, Lil Man took his concerns to MC and pleaded with him to give Pablo a pass. MC was my mentor, so I knew him very well. He was a laid-back and mellow kind of dude who wouldn't hesitate to spill blood when it was necessary. But MC was also fair and was known to be diplomatic when it came to his people. I know that some people will equate this to him compromising the rules and the normal protocol in situations like this. But here's the thing. I think what it really came down to is his affinity for a fellow C and to spare him the grief of having to watch his younger brother get stabbed. If Lil Man wouldn't have been there, MC would have had no problem with having Pablo whacked. I know this for a fact, so it's not like he was yielding to favoritism or that he was giving Pablo some kind of preferential treatment. That's all it was. It was nothing more than showing a fellow C some sympathy or some compassion. It's synonymous to a cop not indicting someone's 90-year-old mother even though he knows for a fact that she was involved in some type of criminal activity. He could do it if he really wanted to, and by all rights, it's technically what he's supposed to do in terms of the legalities. But yet, he shows some morals and some compassion because there's just something morally wrong about seeing some 90-year-old lady with a walker walk into the courtroom. I use this real-life example because this actually happened to that greaseball Lencho. He got his own 90-year-old mother involved in his criminal affairs by setting her up and having her make several three-way calls for him while he orchestrated a plan to smuggle drugs into the county jail. And that's exactly what the cops said in their police reports, that they technically could have indicted his mom, but that they ultimately chose not to because they wanted to show that they still maintained some level of morals. So after hearing Lil Man out, MC decided to veto Smiley's decision to hit Pablo, and he told Chilo to abort the mission. He basically gave Pablo a pass, but it was also stipulated that the accusations against Pablo would then undergo a thorough investigation. Needless to say, this wasn't a popular decision amongst some of the other C's, and although they complied and respected MC's decision, they made no secrets about the fact that they would later be asking for a full investigation. Not only surrounding the issues that Pablo was in question for, but also about MC's decision to give him a pass. And furthermore, it was also stipulated that Lil Man would ultimately bear the full brunt of the responsibility for this, since he was the one who was technically raising his hand for Pablo. So it was clearly understood and agreed that if the investigation didn't go in Pablo's favor, that Lil Man would squarely suffer the consequences himself. This was a ballsy move for Lil Man because I'm pretty sure he knew that the investigation wouldn't end good for his brother. I personally think he was just biding time and doing whatever was necessary to make sure Pablo wasn't hit. Maybe he just thought he could overcome whatever kind of adversity this would later bring, and that it wouldn't fester the way that it did. At any rate, Pablo was allowed to stay and the investigation then commenced. As far as MC's position and his stance on this, to be honest with you, MC's decision shouldn't have been debated, nor should it have been second guessed. As the authority in charge, he isn't required to explain his reasoning for doing what he did. Even though it didn't seem right on the face of the circumstances, there could have been 1,000 reasons justifying him handling it the way he did, period. And as a Cat 3, he didn't have to explain himself to any of the others there that were with him. If it ever became an issue later, the only ones MC would be required to answer to later is Brass, NF leadership. But by this time, Smiley's head was already swelling up and he was slowly transforming into a power-hungry, self-claimed high-ranking leader. He had already tasted the authority and had gotten a taste of the money-making potential that Salinas had to offer. And the more time that passed, the more he wanted it all for himself. Truth be told, he wanted to be MC. He wanted his position and he wanted to be the quintessential leader of Salinas just like him. The cold reality about all of this is that this is the kind of payback MC was in line to get for making Smiley one of his proteges. Not even a year earlier, MC and Art Big Smiley Ramirez from Salinas had pulled me, Rico, Lobo, Chente, and Gerald also Winston from Santa Rosa all at the same time while we were there in San Quentin. And although MC would become my mentor and I would gather a significant amount of schooling from him, Smiley, Lobo, and Chente were technically considered MC's proteges. All the schooling they had came through him. MC was the kind of C who would invest a considerable amount of time indoctrinating C's and NR members that were under his tutelage. He took those fundamental responsibilities serious and never denied any of the brothers any opportunity to gain more enlightenment. But here's where things began to spiral downward. When MC would go back to prison on a parole violation or a new case, Smiley or Lobo would step up as interim RCs until MC would get released. At times, when he was away, two things would happen that would eventually become the basis for an internal power struggle and ultimately MC's demise. The first thing that happened is that Smiley and Lobo transformed into power-wielding dictators who began wreaking havoc all over Salinas. The power basically went to their heads, and because of the way they were controlling the streets, it discouraged a lot of ends and caused them to disassociate themselves away from the NF street activities. The second and most critical thing that happened is that Smiley and Lobo developed such a strong penchant for the power they wielded as interim RCs that they didn't want to relinquish this authority back to MC whenever he got back out, and this caused a lot of bad blood. They began to view MC more as a liability and almost as if he was beginning to get in the way of business that was self-benefited. Because along with the position came the power, the respect, the influence, and most importantly of all, the money. The money stopped, and this was at the root of it all. A few months later, after the incident with Pablo, MC was transported to San Quentin to finish up a parole violation. During this specific period of time, Lobo was appointed to act as the interim RC until MC returned from his violation. Sometime around February of 1995, MC was released from San Quentin. He returned to Salinas and began picking up where he had left off. MC contacted Lobo and regained his authority. One of the first orders of business he conducted was to organize a mandatory regimental meeting for everyone under his guidance to attend. The meeting was held at the home of Sophie Rocha, Mateo's sister, who was considered to be a strong NF associate. The whole purpose of the meeting was for MC to consult, prepare, and assign his manpower to their respective positions. Smiley was assigned to function as MC's second, or his reserve commander. If anything was to happen to MC, Smiley was to automatically assume his position. Lobo was assigned to oversee and manage all the financial investments and to build up the regiment's arsenal. Chilo was assigned or appointed to protect the leadership, and his job was in essence to act as MC's personal bodyguard. Chente and Lil Man were assigned to act as foot soldiers and to assist working with the regiment's manpower. After their first meeting, everyone was basically eager to get back to work and get things started. The entire regiment had been assigned a position, and each member knew his responsibilities. Over the course of the next few weeks, MC continued to manage the regiment. Things were slow-paced, uneventful, and pretty much laid back. However, on March 7, 1995, MC and Chilo decided to spend the night out on the town, and they made plans to meet at the Harmony Club, a local Salinas bar on Alisal Avenue. They jumped into MC's white 1985 Ford Mustang and headed for the bar. As soon as they pulled up and turned into the nightclub's parking lot, VSU, violent suppression units, lit them up and pulled them over. Because they were both on high control parole with gang stipulations, they were both arrested and transported to the Monterey County Jail. When you're on high control parole, and if you're around someone who they consider to be a gang member, they'll violate you. A week later, after getting funneled through the Santa Rita County Jail, MC was back in San Quentin doing a 1-year violation. This is when parole was really parole. There wasn't none of these flash violations or these 30-day dryouts. If you got a year, you got a year. I got smacked with a flat year violation every time I got arrested. So when MC landed in San Quentin on this particular parole violation, I was there with him. I was already there housed in the adjustment center when he pulled up and got there. This would be one of the many times that we'd end up doing time together right there in San Quentin. Over the course of the next couple of years, the dissension within the Salinas regiment would only continue to escalate. This is around the time that the bloodletting on the streets started to begin. The internal conflicts that arose and developed within D facility, better known as the D facility dilemmas, had already transpired, and a C from Salinas named Angel Chongo Alvarez was one of the first to die. Chongo died on February 12, 1997, 1 month after being released from prison. He was stabbed to death and his mutilated body was found in a parked car behind the Acosta Plaza apartments on Sanborn. No arrests were ever made in this murder. However, there was speculation that there were strong links to the conflict between Art Big Smiley Ramirez from Salinas and Pablo Pantera Peña from San Jose. Sometime in the beginning of 1997, I ended up in the adjustment center at San Quentin with MC again. I was back on a new commitment and MC was finishing up another short parole violation. This time, Salvador Little Man Castaneda was also there and was set to parole in March. Keep in mind that a significant amount of time had passed since the investigation had commenced involving Pablo and Little Man both. As I had alluded to earlier, Little Man had raised his hand for his brother Pablo, and it was agreed at that time that Little Man would suffer the consequences if the investigation on Pablo ended up going bad. I had heard about this later as MC had told me about it, but as far as I was concerned at the time, this wasn't any of my business and was an internal issue involving the Salinas regiment. Sometime around February, MC told me to pull Little Man aside and to basically advise him that he was on freeze per text and leadership in the Bay. In retrospect, when I look back on everything, I believe the reason MC didn't want to convey this information to Little Man himself is because MC knew or felt that this may have been the beginning of the end for Little Man. I think he felt bad. I still recall that day and the conversation like it was yesterday. When I told Little Man what I was told to tell him, I could clearly see his mind working and the fear was clearly visible. It's like all the blood drained from his face and I could see him swallowing hard. All he kept saying is why. I obviously couldn't give him an answer and I don't think this helped him feel any better about it either. I honestly didn't know. I had a feeling, but I wasn't gonna speculate. I just told him, hey bro, if you didn't do nothing wrong, then you ain't got nothing to worry about. It'll all work itself out. That's all I could tell him. For the next month, until he paroled, he was different. He was withdrawn, his mind was somewhere else, and you could just tell he was worried about the position he was in. Now here's where things get interesting. MC ended up paroling sometime at the end of February, a week or two before Little Man was due to parole himself. I remember this because they had made plans to link back up. On March 7th, 1997, Little Man paroled right there from San Quentin, shortly after MC, and went back out to the streets feeling a little more confident since he knew MC would be out there with him. What Little Man didn't know is that the investigation on Pablo had wrapped up and things didn't go in his favor. Pablo was found guilty of treason, and now it was time to pay the piper. Unfortunately for Little Man, good news usually travels slow, but when it comes to bad news, it travels with lightning speed because there's never a shortage of people who are willing to pass it. That's just the way it is. And unfortunately for Little Man, targets are always the last one to find out. Although Pablo's status on the streets was common knowledge, Little Man didn't have a clue. All Little Man knew was that MC brought him into the mob, and because of this, he assumed he would always have his back. However, any smart Familiano knows that the mob has never had any qualms when it's come to eating its own, and that even in this game, individual loyalty goes out the window when you run the risk of being eaten yourself. After being released from prison, Little Man was escorted to the Greyhound bus station where he purchased a ticket and boarded a bus headed for Salinas. He made one phone call. That was to Lobo, informing his crew boss that he was on his way and that he was officially plugging back in. Meanwhile, as soon as Lobo hung up the phone, he called Albert Bird Laris and told him that their target was on the way and to bring a gun. Note, the following information came straight from Lobo after he decided to cooperate with the FBI during their debriefing. Up until he revealed the details of this incident, the investigation was still ongoing and they had no idea who Lil Man's killer was. When Lobo picked Bird up, he told Bird that he was going to be the gunner, and he told Bird that he'd cue him when it was time to pull the trigger. That he'd give him a signal and to just wait until he let him know when to do it. Keep in mind that this murder was hastily planned. It was put together at the last minute, and these guys didn't have any contingencies set up at all. In fact, there was no planning whatsoever. The only thing Lobo told Bird is that Bird was going to carry out the murder and to bring the gun. And also that Lobo would give Bird a signal. That was it. So when Lobo and Bird finally arrived at the location they had arranged to pick him up at, Lobo was driving and Bird was sitting in the back seat. Again, here's another situation where a car pulls up with the homeboy driving, an empty front seat, and another homeboy sitting in the back seat by himself. How or why Lil Man didn't see this is beyond my comprehension. If he was in solid standings and he had absolutely no reason to worry about something like this, then maybe I could understand. But Lil Man had just been placed on freeze and knew he had reasons to be on his toes. Maybe he just had so much trust for these two brothers that it didn't occur to him. But this was a fatal mistake, a mistake that could have possibly saved his life. And again, it's in light of the fact of someone who's in questionable standings. Lil Man knew there was an investigation going on, but yet he somehow slept on this one. So for whatever reason, when Bird leaves to go meet Lobo, he grabs a small revolver and only brings 2 bullets. That's all he had. These guys got 2 bullets to kill Lil Man, but in Bird's mind of minds, he obviously thought that this was enough. This ain't Hollywood. People don't always die when you shoot them once or twice, even if they're both headshots. In fact, when Bird told Lobo that he only had 2 bullets, Lobo was pissed. He obviously didn't understand Bird's thinking either, but apparently this is the only weapon Bird had and he didn't have enough time to go buy more bullets. Lil Man was already in transit and this whole plot was already in motion. According to Lobo, he just emphasized to Bird to just make sure he took 2 headshots to make both bullets count because they didn't even have a knife if the gun failed to kill him. As they were driving along the outskirts of Salinas, they engaged in small, insignificant conversation with Lil Man just for the purpose of making him feel at ease and so as to not make him feel uncomfortable. Similar to the way a male mannequin does the moonwalk, the courting dance when he's trying to entice a mate. When they got close to Castroville, Lobo turned to look at Bird and told him that he was going to take a shortcut and turn down one of the dirt roads. This is where everything got messy. Bird jumped the gun, assuming that this was Lobo's signal to kill Lil Man, but it really wasn't. Lobo was just telling them that he was going to go down the dirt road so they could do it somewhere off the main road. Lobo didn't want it done inside the car because of the obvious DNA evidence and all the blood that would have got on the interior of the car. But like I said, assuming that this was his signal, Bird put the gun to the back of Lil Man's head and pulled the trigger. The bullet wasn't a kill shot. It didn't even penetrate Lil Man's skull. Instead, it kind of grazed him and traveled deep around the side of his head. But what it did do was it knocked Lil Man out unconscious. The bullet was synonymous to getting smacked in the back of the head with a baseball bat. It made Lil Man slump over forward to where he was kind of laying on the dashboard moaning and bleeding. Lobo, startled himself by the unexpected loud gunshot, turns to Bird and says, "What the fuck you doing, bro? You weren't supposed to do this shit in my car. Now he's gonna bleed all over the interior of my fucking car." Lobo's pissed off now. He pulls over and tells Bird that they need to hurry up and get him out of the car because he's bleeding everywhere. Lil Man still doesn't know what's going on and is still knocked out. He's still leaning forward with his forehead laying on the dash. According to Lobo, Lil Man just kept moaning and he kept trying to say something, but he still wasn't moving. By this time, Lobo and Bird go into straight panic mode. They begin to worry about other cars driving by, cops patrolling the area, or a farm worker possibly rolling up on them. With one bullet left and in the dark, they drag Little Man out of the car, laying him in the dirt, and then shoot him one more time in the eye. And even then, this shot took some luck and some creativity. They couldn't even see. They had pulled over next to an artichoke field and there wasn't any lighting in that area. Bird literally had to reach down with one hand, feel around for Little Man's face, and then use the tip of his index finger to find Little Man's eye. Once he poked him in his eye and he was sure he found it, he reached down holding the gun with his other hand, stuck the barrel of the gun next to his finger and pulled the trigger. Luckily for them both, the shot reached its intended mark and hit Little Man in the eye. Now, one of the other craziest parts of this story is the whole thing about Little Man's fingers being placed in an alleged 14 by the killers in an effort to throw off law enforcement. When Lobo was asked about this, he apparently couldn't stop laughing and swore up and down that that whole story was some bullshit. Whether some creative homicide detective's mind looked at the position Little Man was laying in and came up with this idea himself, or whether Little Man formed his fingers like this in some last-minute effort to show some allegiance, nobody will ever know. That's up for speculation. You can draw your own conclusions by looking at the actual crime scene photos that's inserted here, but one thing's for sure, Lobo said it wasn't done by either him or Bird, and this story is completely bogus. Actually, the pictures cannot be seen on YouTube, so for those of you that want to see the actual pictures, they're on our Patreon page. The rest of the story is history. Lobo flipped. Bird would later end up getting convicted and sentenced to life in federal prison after he was indicted with Mad Dog from Stockton, Happy from Lodi, Hennessy from San Francisco, and Skip from San Jose. The details of this murder will be highlighted in the next profile we're putting out called Mad Dog's Missionaries. The victim was a norteño out of San Jose who had fallen into bad standings named Martin Kung Fu Chacon, who was set up by Bird, another NF member named Angel YB Martinez, and a couple other NR members. I'm going to keep this profile short so I can start putting out more content for you guys. Every once in a while, I'll drop a long profile like I did on the Watsonville Hitters, but for the most part, I'm going to start shortening these up so I can be more consistent and just for the purpose of generating more content. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. Our goal is to get Mad Dog's Missionaries out by the end of the week. But in the meantime, continue to submit your questions in any of our comment sections so we can get out another Q&A. Thank you guys for showing us the support that you have. Without you guys, we would cease to exist.